Today we'll quickly look at the other two aspects, though we'll not go in any detail.
Okay.
For creating tables, which is from an existing table and manually, we'll just look at the screen layout. Everything else remains the same, so we'll not talk about that. Um, okay. So I want to create a new table. Let's call it table underscore existing test. Everything else remains the same. It is here that I can select an existing table or data set to create my current table from. So I can come in here, select any of the existing tables or data sets. So I am, for example, selecting this one, say next. And now I can decide which of these existing tables that I want to remove, or which of the fields from the existing tables I want to keep, I want to remove, I want to add. I can go ahead and decide that. So I can change the field type and all the same basic configurations. And then if I want, in addition to this, I can add any new fields as well. So this is similar to copying a report from a standard report, or copying an existing custom report, and then we go ahead and modify our rows. We can add columns. This is exactly same concept. So we'll not go ahead and save this because we don't need this for our use case. Just wanted to show you that this is also an option available. Okay, and finally, we can create a table manually. So I can come in here, I can create a table, ZF, manual table, select this, and then I can select the option manual and I can decide all the fields. So this is where I'll go ahead and give a field name. So I'm calling it, let's say, worker. API name gets automatically assigned. If I want, I can go ahead and change it. And let me select instance field. And this is where I can select my business object. So I'm selecting my business object, for example, is worker. And then I can mark whether this is a required or optional. And I can add new fields. So this is how I can add fields, or I can create a table manually. Exactly same concept. I can decide the field names, the API names, the field type, the configuration, whether it is a required or whether it is a primary key. And that's it.
Okay.
All right, so I'll not save this as well. Just wanted to quickly show that to you. Okay, so for the purpose of our use case, we have a couple of stages, and a specifically one stage which is called union. So yesterday when we created our table using file upload, we used two files. One I think was from 2020 and the other one was 2021. Now instead of adding 2022 file as well to the existing table, what I'll do is I'll create a data set. So, and that will help us in our use case for doing a union, right? Else all I can do is I can simply go ahead and create a new data change task and upload or insert the 2022 data as well into the existing table. but we'll not go ahead and do that. So for that, we'll go ahead and create a data set. Okay, so what is a data set?
So is it
Or
the basic
what?
data set or the derived
Yeah,
data set?
base data set.
Basic data set, how can I define it?
So the simplest way to define, or this is how I remember a data set. A data set defines or contains some processing, some example rows of the data it contains, plus all the processing logic for modifying that data. So that's
Okay.
how a data set is defined. So it contains some data as well as the metadata, right? That is
Right,
the
right.
simplest example by which I remember a data set.
I
Okay,
was
what
about to
are
say it has a
Mhm,
schema and there is
mhm,
some, not a derived data set, not the entire transformation, but you
mhm.
have some
Some
basic
processing
transformation.
logic.
Right, right. That's what I was about to say. But yeah,
Perfect. Okay, and what are the different options for creating a base data set
so you have file upload, uh, SFTP,
and a
and
custom report?
custom report. Yeah.
Okay, so let's quickly create from a custom report, though we'll not use this, but I'll
Okay.
quickly show this to you. I think we have already seen this, but let's quickly do that. Okay, so I want to create a base data set using a custom report. I will select the name of the custom report. Now, this is something which is different between a base data set and a table. Uh, and that is, let's take this one as an example. It allows me to define the report criteria. Now, this is not possible with a
Table.
table. Now, the reason is with table, we actually don't default, or we don't link the creation criteria with how we extract data, right? We always have the option of changing the way we extract data during the subsequent data change activities. But with respect to a base data set, we can specify the report criteria. Okay, then I can specify restricted to environment. This basically ensures that if I specify some environment, so let's say I specify implementation, if when I migrate these changes to production, my data load would fail unless I go ahead and update the restricted to environment to production. So this ensures that we are not running uh, any non-production data to production data and vice versa.
Okay.
Uh, okay, now we have the different run options. So I can run it now, but we can also create an integration schedule. We'll look at that schedule later. So we can go ahead and define an integration schedule and define a run frequency for that integration. I'll select run now. What happens if I say run once in future? My data set would get created, but until and unless that future point in time, that run doesn't complete, my
Mm-hmm.
data set would remain empty.
Right.
So I want data to be loaded in my data set. So I'm calling it okay. With a table, the API name gets automatically okay, it's created. Okay, I can run a data set in replace mode in an append mode. I think we discussed this. So what would be the difference?
Append is just adding to the existing data, but replace
Mhm.
means you're truncating, basically deleting and uploading again, like a kind of full
Yeah.
load.
So replace Workday deletes all existing data in the data set and replaces it with data it imports from the custom report during each integration run. And append, Workday keeps the existing data in the dataset and adds to it the new data it imports from the custom report during each integration run. So when do you think you would use an append mode versus a replace mode?
So replace, what I can think of is if you are adding a new field,
Mm-hmm,
then usually I'll go for a replace, or if you're
mm-hmm,
changing the data type. But append, say for example, if your filter criteria is changing, so today you have
mm-hmm,
10 locations, if
mm-hmm,
you add one more location, so instead of deleting the entire set, you can just add that location in the
mm-hmm.
selection criteria or in the prompts, and you can just do the append.
Okay, that would be perfect. There would be one other scenario wherein, or use case as such, wherein you would want to use append mode. So anywhere we want to do trending reporting using our.
Uh, I you
Mhm,
initially started with the trended report, yes. Uh, so you said there is an effective date or the from
right,
date, so that you can append and see the trended data over the
right.
days. Yeah.
So one thing to remember, that Workday imports all data in the report during every integration run, resulting in duplicate data in the data set. So select append for a custom report dataset when you want a snapshot of the custom report data to maintain history in the dataset for trending use cases.
Gotcha.
So we will use append whenever we have a trending use case. That's one of the use case apart from what you mentioned. Okay, so it allows you to capture snapshot of the data, let's say on a monthly basis or on a yearly basis. And then you can build a report to a trending report to get the trend. So that would be another use case for using an append mode.
Okay.
So I'm using replace. We don't need this use case. I'm just using it. Okay, so my data set is created. Now, with respect to our data set, we don't have the option to assign it to a tag when the data set is created. So I'll have to remove my tag filter, search for my data set. So this is my base data set that I created just now. I'll come in here. I have the option to edit the tag from here. Okay, if my activity is complete, it would also go ahead and load data. So this usually takes some time. So once my activity is complete, it will go ahead and load data into my base data set. Okay,
So because
that's
this is a new one, you created a new activity, right?
yes. So with respect to our base data set, what did we select? We selected run now. If you remember, with respect to our data set, we have this integration schedule. So we can say, okay, create this data set, but also run now. Or we can say, okay, we just want a data set to be created, but we don't want it to be loaded with data right now. We want it to be loaded with data in the future. So we can say run now, run once in future, or we can define an integration schedule to run on a daily or a weekly or whatever basis. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so I can come in here and my data set has data. Okay, now if I come in here and apply my filter, I have 3 data sets. Okay, we'll also look at the data set to be created from SFTP, but we don't have the SFTP details, SFTP server, so we'll not be able to create anything as such, but I'll quickly show you how it is created. So I want to create a new base data set from SFTP. Okay, here I can specify the file pattern. So what is a file pattern? Let's say you want to create your data set by importing, let's say this is how your file looks. It
Yep.
says employee perception survey, and then uh,
There is a
the
hyphen
remaining
and
pattern is
flex.
same, right?
Right.
2020, 2021, 2022. So what I can define is I can say
Employee
EMP
survey star.
perception survey, and then the rest of the pattern is common.
Yep.
So what I can do is I can either use an asterisk or a question mark. So
Okay.
what does it mean? The report will see all files in the specified SFTP address, which has employee perception survey, followed by this pattern. So it checks all files which have this pattern, and then wherever there is an asterisk, it sees, okay, there are more than one character after this.
Star
Okay,
dot
so
star.
star sign could be 0 to multiple characters. If let's say
Oh,
there's
okay.
just one character, then there's a question mark. So let's say
Okay.
this is how your file is. So I am creating a text document. Let's say your file pattern is ABC1,
Okay.
and then let's say your other files are ABC2. Okay, so now your file pattern is ABC question mark, and the reason you're putting question mark is because there's just one character or one
Okay.
alphabet which is different. So now your integration knows, okay, this pattern remains the same, and then there is one character that is different. Makes sense?
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, in integrations, we use star dot star,
Yeah.
so that we
So
know.
exactly. So here as well, you can still use star. So
Okay.
when star is used, then the integration knows, or then this schedule would know that after ABC, there could be 0 or more than one characters.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Here
Yeah.
it knows it's dynamic. Question marks, it knows, okay, there is exactly one character after this.
Okay.
Okay, so all right. So since you build integrations, you are already aware. So I can specify the SFTP
Yep.
address. I
Yep.
can specify the directory. What do you mean by use temp file? Do you use the same thing in
Yeah.
integrations as well?
Yeah. Yeah. We use that because uh, again, you are already aware of it, right?
Yeah,
Temp files before if
loading
it
data.
is right, if there is 100 KB of data, usually it will
Right.
take time. So that temp file will not make it will make sure that the processing or the vendor system will
Mm,
not read the file before this
yeah,
completes. Kind of stacking.
yeah. So Workday automatically creates this randomly generated file
Right.
if
Right.
the file is very long.
Right.
Uh,
But
okay.
it can cause issues.
I am not aware of integration use
Yeah.
case.
Yeah, because usually what it does is, it, like you
Mm,
said, it will create a temporary file. So
mhm,
if there is a temporary file, if you are using not every cloud system, but
mhm.
there are some cloud systems that it will not read the gibberish temporary files. So
Oh,
then it
okay,
will
okay.
throw error.
Got it.
So not just an FYI, because
Mm, okay, makes
yeah,
sense. Makes sense.
yeah,
Okay. Then you have your authentication method, your username, password, which is again the same. Again, delete after retrieval.
hmm,
So if you want to delete the source file in the SFTP server after data is read, then you can select this checkbox. Okay, so it will import the data from the SFTP file and delete the source file in the SFTP server. Okay, we really don't need to use this checkbox because I think it's the same case for integrations as well, right? So
right,
Workday reads both compressed and decompressed files, and then you can use the I think it's PGP
right.
decryption option. Again, we can specify the restricted to environment. Everything else is exactly the same. Obviously, we don't have the SFTP address details, so we'll
That's
not
fine. That's
go
fine.
any
I know.
further.
Yep.
Okay, so we have a very specific use case to get data um, or to union data, and that's why we will create one more base data set from file. And the file I'm using is 2022. So I've selected create data set, base data set from a file, and the moment I did that, it asked me for the file to select. And this is where I am. Okay, so at this point in time, I think we can also talk about the parsing options. Again, I believe you would have looked at these parsing options in integrations as well, but let's quickly have a discussion. So the parsing options basically define or identify how data would be read.
So, if you don't mind, can you go
Uh-huh.
back and show me how we came into this one?
Yeah,
I thought
just
you.
I'm just going back. I'm just
Okay. Okay.
looking for my parsing notes. Give me a quick second. I would. Okay, there are some restrictions with respect to reading data from the SFTP. The
Mhm.
number of files should be less than 5,000.
Okay.
So when reading data from an SFTP, number of files must be less than 5,000. Okay, the maximum amount of time or total time to transfer data must be less than 5 hours. And then each file on the server should be less than 1 GB compressed, or it should be less than 10 GB uncompressed. Okay, so these are the 3 restrictions when you want to create data from and read data from an SFTP server.
Yep.
I'm quickly checking the restrictions. Just give me one moment. Okay, I cannot think of any restrictions with respect to any other thing. Okay, so how did I come here? Let me cancel. So I am in my data catalog. I want to create a new base data set.
Okay.
I'll come to create. I'll select the option base data set
Right.
and from file.
Okay. Okay.
So this is the option I'm selecting from
Okay.
file. It will ask me to pick up the file that I
Okay.
want to use. So I'm selecting the file that I'm using, which is the third file, and I'll click on OK. So this takes me to the parsing screen.
Okay. So you said base data set can do some transformation. So this is
Yeah.
the parsing function.
This is not the transformation. This is just the reading part. So we'll
Okay.
talk about transformations and stages
Okay.
later. Okay.
Okay.
So parsing is just one of the stages. So similar to how a table or a base data set can import data through a custom report or through an SFTP server. Similarly, when it reads data through a file, it has to parse data. If you remember, when we created our table as well, if I go ahead and create my table, if I come and create my table and select exist file upload, select a file, let's say this one, click on next, it takes me to the exact same screen. Parsing options.
Okay.
So what is parsing? Parsing is nothing but reading data from a file into your table or a data set.
Okay.
Okay, now the parsing options are similar in both a table as well as a data set.
Okay.
Okay, so we can specify a description. We can specify a row delimiter. So what is a row delimiter? A row delimiter is what lets the table or the base data set know when a given row comes to an end and when the new row starts. So with respect to parsing, the first thing we have is row delimiter, and this is a single character that separates rows, which is basically records in your source file. And usually this would be a new line character, right? Which is basically a enter.
Right.
So wherever in this file I have a new line character and enter, that's where Workday knows, okay, this is where my row comes to an end and it adds a new row to my table. So my Workday automatically identifies these parsing options. But at this point in time, if I want, I can go ahead and change them.
Oh.
So my row delimiter specifies a character that separates new rows, and Workday has defaulted it to any new line. There are some other options as well. So instead of this, I could have said, okay, a tab is a new line character. I could have selected pipe or any of these options. Okay, then we have field delimiter. So this is how Workday knows how to load data into different columns.
Right.
So in my report, because this is a comma separated file and CSV, the field delimiter is identified as a comma. So this is how Workday is creating these various columns. So it knows, okay, this is E21002 has to be part of first column, followed by 2022, which is a new column, and then these numbers in each in different column. So a field delimiter, it again is a character which identifies or which allows Workday to know how to create those columns or to separate data in different fields. So the second parsing option is field delimiter, and it is usually a comma. A single character that separates the fields or columns of a row in your source data files. And it is usually a comma. Okay, then we have field names. Now with respect to field names, the default option is use value from the first row. So here it is using values from the very first row, which is Do we have it open? So it basically checks what is the first row, and I think we looked at it yesterday as well.
Right.
So it is checking column. These are all blank, so it is giving
Right.
some random name, and that's
Right.
what it is doing. Okay, now there are some additional options as well. So
Okay.
we have a few additional characters. We have escape character, we have quote character, we have the number of rows to ignore. So first thing, I'll select that one row should be ignored because it is probably a comment, right? Which is also the case for us. So because in this file, this is only some comments that I would be using for building my custom report. I want Workday to ignore this particular row. So I've said, okay, ignore the first row. And now Workday correctly identifies my column headers.
Right.
So I can say, okay, ignore some X number of rows. If I don't do
Right.
that,
It will take whatever is the first row.
yeah. So now it is doing fine,
Okay.
but
Okay.
then it takes, because we have already defined the rows earlier. If you
Mhm.
remember, it was saying column 1, column 2, and now it says belonging and then equity. So this is what it is doing. Wherever
Right.
it is blank, earlier it was just saying column 1, column 2. Now it is saying, because we already said ignore one row. So now
Right.
it has read employee here, but then here it says belonging and here it says equity and so on and so forth. So I want, because these are all my comments, I want Workday to ignore the top n rows, and I can define them here, which is also the case if you remember for table as well. We said, so this is what, if you see the table, it did. So here it said field 1, field 2, and then
Right.
belonging, field 3, field 4, and then equity. So we want one row to be ignored. Okay. All right, then we have a few additional characters. So we have something called an escape character, we have a quote character, and we have a comment character. Let's start with a quote character. Uh, okay, so let's say this is how my, let me give an example. So let's say there is one column in my table which has data in this format. So we have weekly special, we have wine, beer, and soda, and then we have 2 for 1 or 9 point or 10 rupees or $10, whatever each. So let's say I have a number of columns. Let's say I have employee ID, or this is some item, and this is a rate. So this is item 1, item 1, and this is the rate for it. It's some weekly special. Let's say item 2, and then item 3 or whatever. I'm just making some random example. And then there are additional columns as well. Now, when this data gets loaded into my tables or my base data set I'm creating, I want Workday to know that this is a single value, which has to be loaded into a single, which has to be
Then.
parsed into a single cell or single column within the table or the data set. The same is the case here as well. The same is the case here as well. Now, this is where I specify quote character. So what is a quote character? A quote character is that character which lets Workday know that a certain value is has to be loaded into a single cell. So instead of writing it this way, this is how I'll write them. So it has to be, instead of weekly special, I will go ahead and include it in a quote character. And let's say my quote character is this double asterisk, if I'm not wrong. So this identifies my quote character. Make sense?
Yeah.
Similarly here, I'll go ahead and enclose it within a quote character.
We do the same in integrations as well. So because data can be a
That's
comma
right.
delimited for CSVs, so
Right.
usually we'll enclose in the double quotes for names or any kind of text
Exactly.
fields, we
Right.
enclose in double quotes.
Right. So this ensures, if you see else, comma is my row separator.
Mhm.
If I don't enclose it into a quote character, then Workday would go ahead and arrange them in 3 separate rows, right? Because for Workday, this is my row separator. So that is where we go ahead and use a quote character. So in our case here, what is our quote character? The, oh, the quote character is a double quote.
Double quote.
Okay, then why do we use an escape character?
This is what I was wondering, like, why do you use an escape character? I was
Okay,
just
now
thinking.
if you see, now this is my actual data, right?
Mhm.
2 for 1 or 10 pounds each with these double quotes. So here
Right,
my double quote is also part of my data,
right,
right? So
right.
now I'll go ahead and use, so here I want this double quote to be part of my data and Workday to know that this is not my quote character,
Okay, okay,
right? So this
okay,
is where I'll go ahead and use an escape character. So I'll
okay,
go ahead and escape this with an escape character.
okay.
So wherever my quote character is part of my data, then I'll go ahead and escape it with an escape character.
Okay. Gotcha.
Okay, so I would not make notes for others. I'll just make notes for escape character. So it specifies a single character which is used to escape the quote character. So this is when if your data contains quote character as data, those characters must be escaped and the entire field value must be enclosed with the quote character. So two things that we'll have to do. We'll have to escape these quote characters because they are part of our data.
Mhm.
And then the entire field value once again must be enclosed within the quote character. So we have done both of that. We have included this within a quote character and we have escaped those quotes which are part of our data with an escape character. Okay, so Workday automatically identifies all these based on your data, but then at this point in time, you can go ahead and make changes if you want to.
Okay.
Okay, I'll say next. I'll go ahead and give a name. Okay, so this also contains my survey data. So I'm simply saying employee survey details for 1. I'm linking it to a tag. I'm saying save. And my data set is created. My data is not yet published. This will just take a bit of time, and then I'll have my data set published. Sorry, my data set loaded with values.
Okay.
So now we have created all our tables as well as data sets, base data sets at least. Any questions?
Yeah. No.
Okay, perfect. So now we'll go ahead and talk about stages and pipelines. So all the data that we needed, or most of the data that we'll needed, I think we'll create one more data set later. We have loaded that data into our Prism environment.
Okay.
Now this is where we can start doing transformations or modifications. So as I mentioned earlier, we can do some amount of transformations in our base data set as well, and we'll see what transformations are allowed within a base data set. But then most of the transformations that we'll do it by creating a derived data set. Okay, so before creating our derived data set, we'll talk about something called stages and pipelines. Okay, now every data set that we create. So let's talk about pipeline first. So what is a data set? Any data set that we create, whether it is a base data set or a derived data set, it contains one or more pipelines. So data set contains one or more pipelines. Now this is not very apparent in a base data set. That's why I didn't talk about it, but we'll create a derived data set and then we'll also look at the base data set and see how the pipeline looks. So every data set contains either one, at least a minimum of one, or more than one pipelines. Now, what is a pipeline? A pipeline is a container of stages. Again, what is a stage? We'll just go ahead and look at that. That models the flow of how data should be transformed. So pipeline basically identifies or defines how data in the data set will get transformed.
Okay.
So a pipeline is basically a collection of stages. Now each stage would go ahead and transform data in certain way.
Okay.
So irrespective of any type of pipeline, right? The first stage is importing data or parsing data. Now, if you remember, when we just created our base data set, the first transformation we did was to parse that data.
Right.
What is parsing data? Basically importing data from your source file. Similarly, when we create our base data set through a Workday report as well, if I go ahead and open it at this point in time, so let me open this report. If I come here and click on edit transformations, now what did I say a pipeline does? A pipeline is basically transforming data in some form.
Okay.
So the purpose of a pipeline is to transform data. So if I come to this base data set and if I click on edit transformations, you'll see it has only one pipeline, right? And that pipeline is that it is reading data from the custom report into the data set. So it has one pipeline to read data from the custom report into this data set. And that pipeline has just one stage, which is to parse data.
Okay.
Okay, so and if I open the other data set, which again loads data through a through a file
File.
and click on edit transformations. So every data set, as I discussed, will have at least one or more pipelines. And each pipeline is a collection of stages that transforms data. So once again, with respect to this data set, it has one pipeline. That pipeline imports survey details, and it has one stage which parses the data into this data set. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, now a base data set can only have one pipeline. So a base data set contains only one pipeline. So we cannot add any additional pipelines to a base data set.
Okay.
Whereas a derived data set can contain one or more pipelines based on your requirement.
Okay.
So base data set, any data set will have at least one pipeline. Base data set can contain maximum of one pipeline. A derived data set can contain one or multiple pipelines.
Mm-hmm.
Now each data set, as we just saw, has a primary pipeline. So with respect to your base data set, your primary pipeline is the only pipeline which is available.
Okay.
With respect to a derived data set, it will have again at least one pipeline, which is the primary pipeline. But in addition to that, it can have multiple additional pipelines as well. Okay. The pipelines have an ordered list of stages. So each pipeline consists of one or multiple stages. We'll not add a stage now. We'll create a derived data set, and then we'll see the difference between the stages that can be added on a base data set versus a derived data set. But at this point in time, just we are looking at the fact that each pipeline, whether it is a primary pipeline or additional pipelines, it has an ordered list of stages.
Okay.
So each pipeline has an ordered list of stages, each of which define how to modify the data that at that point in the pipeline. So within a pipeline, see, this is how I visualize it. We have a pipeline which has multiple stages. So we have stage 1 and then stage 2 and stage 3. So this is your pipeline 1. This is your PP1 or your primary pipeline, let's say. So this is our pipeline. Now data enters your pipeline through your stage 1.
Okay.
So your first stage of any pipeline is always brings data into that data set, right? So your first stage, so the first stage of a pipeline brings data into that data set pipeline. So the first stage, if I come here now, the first stage of this pipeline is always importing or parsing data into this pipeline. The output of this stage, right? This stage is bringing data into the pipeline. Then we have the output of this stage, which could be D2. The output of this stage becomes an input to the next stage. Here I can do some transformations, which will modify my data. Then this is my modified data. So in each stage, my data enters. It may go some modification within that stage before, based on the type of that stage, and then data outputs that from that stage, and the output of that stage becomes the input of my next stage.
I think
The
it's kind of studio workflow which we have by looking at it. We have a start component. Without the start component, we cannot even run the integration, basically, you can say. And there is a workflow. So the previous component will becomes your input to the next component. So the next component will become an input to the third component.
Next component.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of a workflow, which is kind of a visualization, I guess.
Yeah. So Workday would have built it on a similar architecture, obviously.
Could be. Yeah.
Right. So the output of the last stage is the output of the entire pipeline.
Okay.
Right. So DD1 was the input of your input data for your pipeline 1. The first stage is what imported data, and the output of the last stage of your pipeline is the output of the entire pipeline. If your data set has multiple pipelines, which is the case with a derived data set, then the output of your primary pipeline is the output of the entire data set. So this could be my primary pipeline, PP, but then let's say this is my derived data set, wherein I have 10 different pipelines. So I have secondary pipeline 1, secondary pipeline 2, and so on and so forth. Now, each of these pipelines in turn may have multiple stages. They may have 10 stages, 20 stages, or whatever. But then the output of my primary pipeline is the output of my derived data set. So if I create a new derived data set, DD2, which imports data from this first derived data set, then the output which is coming from my primary pipeline of this DD1 becomes the input of my DD2. Make sense?
So irrespective of any number of
pipelines we have, right?
The
and
primary pipeline will be the output. Okay.
So the first stage of a pipeline brings data into the data set pipeline. Stages listed after the first stage in a pipeline takes the output of the previous stage as the input of the current stage. So each stage takes output of the previous stage as the input of the current stage. Okay, the last stage of any pipeline is the output of that pipeline. And as we discussed, the output of the primary pipeline is the output of the entire data set. So when we publish a data set, let's say I decide to go ahead and publish this data set. So my Prism data source gets created, and that Prism data source contains the output of this derived data set or the primary pipeline of this derived data set. right? Because the output of the primary pipeline is the output of the entire data set.
One quick question. So if
Yeah,
you go to the
I'm just going there. Let me write
okay.
that down. So therefore, when you publish a data set, the output of the primary pipeline will be materialized as the data in the Prism data source. Yeah, go ahead. So when you publish your data set, it is the output of your primary pipeline which would get materialized or which will be loaded into the Prism data source that gets created. Okay,
So if
where
you
do you
come,
want me to see?
yeah,
Here?
here, right. So if you see there is
Mm-hmm,
PP1 or pipeline one,
mm-hmm,
and there is PP2 and PP3,
mm-hmm,
and it has its own stages.
mm-hmm,
So for PP2 or for the pipeline two,
mm-hmm.
it has to be coming from pipeline one or it is
No,
independently.
not necessary.
Okay,
So my PP, so in this case, my primary pipeline could be importing data from a table. My
okay,
secondary pipeline could be importing data from a completely different base data set or a completely different table, and so on and so forth. We'll just go ahead and look at that in a bit, right?
okay.
So these could be all importing data from wildly different uh, sources. One could be from a table which imports my data, which is part of Workday, and this could be SFTP, and this could be reading a base data set which is created from a file.
Okay.
Okay, so that is a pipeline. Now, easy way to understand this is to create a derived data set. So we have already created a couple of base data sets, and
Mhm,
we see that each of these base data sets have a pipeline, and
mhm.
this pipeline basically defines how we are importing data into these base data sets. Okay, now at this point in time, I want to create my first derived data set. So I'm creating, I'll do it here. Let me cancel this. Okay, so I want to create my derived data set. So I'm selecting the option create and then derived data set. Now my derived data set. So my base data sets and my tables, they import data from outside the Prism environment, right?
Right.
So when I created my base data sets, I either imported data from Workday or through a file or through an SFTP server. All of these were from outside the data catalog. So my base data sets and tables brought data from outside data catalog into my data catalog, which is my
Mhm.
Prism environment.
Right.
In my derived data set, I cannot get data from outside Prism.
Okay.
So I can only create a derived data set either from an existing base data set or
Or
from
from a
an
table.
existing table
Okay.
or from an existing derived data set.
Okay. Okay.
So a derived data set, what they do? They basically transform data. So when would I create my derived data set? When I want to transform data in some format, in some manner, right?
Right.
They can only be created using either an existing table, base data set, or a derived data set. So when I select the option create and then derive data set, it is giving me a list of all existing tables and base data sets. Now, why is it giving me only my ZF training? Because I have put a filter here. So if I remove filter, I can create this derived data set from any of the existing data sets within my data catalog. Makes sense?
Right.
So I can
Right.
remove this. And now if you see, it lists out everything. It lists out base data sets, derived data sets, everything. So for my use case, I only want. Okay, so how would I decide? So the first table or base data set or derived data set that you create for creating your new derived data set becomes the primary pipeline of that derived data set, right? So as I
Right.
mentioned, when creating a derived data set, you can have one or multiple pipelines. So how would you decide which should be your primary pipeline? You would select that table or base data set or derived data set to create your new derived data set, which you want to act as your primary pipeline. Now, how would you decide that? Now here, my use case is, if you see, I have two different types of data. I have employee data, which I'm reading through my custom report, which basically has employee name, their age, and so on and so forth, right? So if you remember employee details, this is my table wherein I come in here and I have created this table and read it through a custom report, and this has the basic employee details, their gender, their nationalities, and so on and so forth. The second data that I have is the employee survey details, right? And the
Right.
third data that I have, this also I created through a custom report. So if when I come here and look at the data, so it has the survey results, right? For 2020 and 2021. 2021. Then I have created one more base data set, which again reads the employee survey details for 2022. Right now, in all of these cases, plus I'll create one more table, which will basically read the employee performance details. So I have 3 or 4 different types of details. I have employee performance details, though we have not created it yet, but let's say we have that. Then we have employee survey details, which are coming from 2 different sources. One is a
Right.
table for 2020-21, and then there is a base data set. Now, out of all these 3, now I'm creating a new derived data set to go ahead and transform this data in these base data sets or tables or whatever. What do you think my primary pipeline should be?
So basically, you're doing trended.
Mhm.
So I will go for survey details.
Okay, so see, when deciding what should be my primary pipeline, I should consider how do I want to structure my data when I'm creating my ultimate reports. Now, if you see, I have the survey details, but the reason I brought these survey details into Prism is so that I can understand this data in conjunction with my employee data, right?
Right.
So I want to understand, okay, employees in, let's say, whether certain employees who are married, what is the survey result of those employees? Employees who belong to a certain religion, what is the survey results of those employees, right? How are my disabled employees feeling about the organization? How are my veterans feeling about the organization? So I want to see all survey data as well as performance data in conjunction with the employees, right?
Okay.
So my employee, if you see what is linking all these 3, it is the
Employee.
employee ID,
Okay.
right? So I would select that primary pipeline, which will allow me to join all the different pipelines.
Okay.
Make sense? And
Yeah.
based
Makes
on
sense.
that itself, I selected that primary key. So based on that, I decided that each of these data sources, which is bringing in data, they would be joined by that employee ID. So that is why all of them have that common field in all the tables and data sets. Make
Right.
sense?
Right. Yeah.
So basically, there are two ways to look at it. One is which is the primary key which will join data in all my data sets and tables.
Mm-hmm.
And in our case, we have selected employee ID, right? The other way to look at it is how do I ultimately want to structure data? So in the data source that gets created, I don't want to structure data based on survey results.
Mm-hmm.
I still want that, but this is how I want it. For employee Logan, who has age ABC, married, not married, blah, blah, blah. 2022, her survey is 1. 2021, her survey is some 2. 2020, her survey is 3. Similarly
Okay.
for Steve, this is how, and similarly her performance for 2022 is ABC, 2022 or whatever. So
Okay.
this is how I want to structure my data. Right? So this all depends on how you design your Prism lineage, right?
Okay.
And there's no right or wrong way.
Okay.
Okay, but this is the best practice. Okay, so now when I'm creating my derived data set, I would select employee details for creating this derived data set. The reason I'm selecting this is because then it becomes the primary pipeline of this derived data set.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can transform all other data around these employee details.
Okay.
Okay, so now I'm selecting employee details. And when I do that, so I'm calling it, I should have called the others as base data set. I'm calling it DDS, and I'm calling it import of employee details for now. I'm linking it to my tag and save. Now this is all I need to do for creating my derived data set. So the first stage, so when I created this derived data set, it created my primary pipeline.
Okay.
And as we discussed, the first stage of your primary pipeline imports data, or for that matter, the first stage of any pipeline imports data into that pipeline. So if I
Mm-hmm.
come here and click on edit transformations, if you see this has created my primary pipeline. Now, what is my primary pipeline? It is this table, ZF training employee details, right? Because I'm importing data from this table.
Mm-hmm.
And the first stage is to import data,
Right.
right? So the first stage of a pipeline brings data into that dataset pipeline, right? Now, as we discussed, in a derived data set, we can have one or more than one pipelines as well. So at this point in time, if you see, because I can have more pipelines, I
Mm-hmm.
have this change pipeline button.
Okay.
Whereas if I look at a base data set, this is my base data set because it can only have one
One
pipeline.
part. Okay.
There's no option to change pipeline because that is the only pipeline I can have, which is also the case for this. Okay, now a pipeline, as we discussed, consists of stages.
Mm-hmm.
So a pipeline, as we discussed, consists of stages. So what is a stage? A stage is a pipeline object that takes in data, transforms it in some way, and outputs modified data, right? So each pipeline can have one or multiple stages. Each stage reads in data, modifies it in some manner, and then it outputs data. The next stage then reads in the output of this previous stage, again does some modification, and then outputs it again. So each stage modifies data in some format. Okay, now a stage, we'll just complete this and then we'll be done. I know you are getting late. So a stage performs a single computational function. So what are some of the transformations that a stage can do? The first transformation that we have looked at is importing data. So import is a stage, right? Similarly, we have also seen a base data set, it parses data.
Right.
So parse is also a stage. What other stages are available? Let's look at our derived data set as well as base data set. So we discussed only certain modifications can be done in a base data set. So,
right.
and we know that all modifications in a data set can only be done in terms of a stages, which means only certain stages can be added to your base data set.
Okay.
So I want to add a new stage, and this is a base data set. When I click on stage, if you see, I can either do filtering, I can do a group by, and I can do manage fields. So there are 3 stages that can be added through any base data set. We'll talk about these stages.
Okay.
Whereas on a derived data set, if you see, I have many other stages. So I have filter, I have group by, I have join, I have again all those stages which can be added to a base data set can still be added here.
Okay.
So I can add filter, group by, manage fields. So filter, group by, manage fields to a derived data set. But in addition to this, I can also do a join, I can do a union, I can do an unpivot, I can do validation, I can do value mapping. So a derived data set can do many other transformations. In addition to all this, at any point in time, whether it is a base data set or a derived data set, I can add Prism calculated fields. And we'll look at that as well.